Greetings, sisters and brothers, friends, comrades. Welcome to African History Club, episode number 27. I'm your host, Milton Ali Mahdi. So today I'm working with headsets, as you can see. I'm hoping that this will improve the sound quality because in the past there had been some complaints by some patrons that the sound was a bit low. So let's see how this works going forward. I want to welcome all new patrons as well. So today, I'm going to be speaking about Walter Rodney. As patrons know, I've spoken about Walter Rodney several times in the past. I've discussed his book, I've discussed his work. Today, I want to speak about him because March is also the month of his birthday. The late Walter Rodney, he would have been 79 this month had he not been assassinated in Guyana in 1980. So as many of you know, I highly recommend Walter Rodney's book, his classic, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. That is one of my favorite books. And what I like about Walter Rodney in particular is that, he was a brilliant academic. I admire his work, just like I admire the works of Samir Amin, Issa Shifty, of course, Kwame Nkrumah's Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, Gunda Frank. And what I like in particular about Walter Rodney was that he combined his intellectual brilliance with his practical involvement with the marginalized communities and the working class all over the world. And today I'm going to be discussing his work in Tanzania, in Jamaica, and ultimately in Guyana, where unfortunately his life also ended. I like Walter Rodney because he brought the ivory tower to the masses. He believed really in, rolling up his sleeve and interacting with the ordinary people to inform them of the condition faced by African countries, Caribbean countries, countries that were historically marginalized, and as he liked to put it, integrated into the global system in a peripheral and dependent condition. Another one of his books I'm reading right now is A History of the Guyanese Working People, 1881-1905. I just started reading that recently. So Walter Rodney thought that the liberation of African countries from European colonial rule, the end of formal colonial rule with independence, and most African countries started winning their independence in the 1960s. That was a historic, monumental achievement, but it was insufficient to transform African societies and to allow Africans to take charge of their destinies and create autonomous, integrated economies that would serve the needs of African people rather than fulfill the demands of the industrialized countries, the countries that had captured Africa in the dependent condition, the metropolitan countries, the metropole, where Africa, of course, became the periphery countries, continent, providing raw material for the factories in the industrial world, providing cheap labor, where everything had been commodified, the people, the resources, the land, the natural and mineral resources, since the 15th century, and which of course is still the prevailing condition today in African countries. So a little bit about Walter Rodney's background. First of all, he was born in 1942 in Guyana. Guyana had been, of course, a British colony, and what was peculiar, actually, one of the consistent ways in which the British ruled their colonial possessions was the classic divide and rule. And in Guyana, we had the African Guyanese population and the Indian Guyanese. And the Indian Guyanese were brought into Guyana after slavery was formally abolished in the 1840s, and that's when really the Indian population increased. And the ruling class kept them at loggerheads, the Afro-Guyanese and the Indian Guyanese, in order to be able to exploit them so that they would be fighting amongst themselves rather than focusing their attention on who really was exploiting them. And that was, of course, capital, British capital. And unfortunately, even after the colonial era ended, and this is obviously something that Walter Rodney, as an adult, later on studied, was that the class that inherited the state, the elite, the new bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie, the Africans and the Indian Guyanese, kept using the system that the British had already implementing, the divide and rule. So even African Guyanese, the elite would use that divide and rule tactic, keeping the Africans and Indians divided in order to consolidate their own control of the state. And then later on, when Indians became the majority and started winning political power, they too used the same tactics that the British had implemented. And that's why Rodney was critical, very critical, of the petty bourgeoisie in the Caribbean as well as in Africa. In fact, they, of course, were successful in throwing out European colonialism, but they actually became quite regressive. And in the end of the day, if you look at it another way, the primary beneficiaries of the end of formal colonialism in Africa and the Caribbean were actually the former colonial powers, because now even the moral obligation as a colonial power over those territories has now been removed. Now they're independent, so now you can exploit them maximally without any obligations. So independence has worked out very well for the former colonial powers, who are the contemporary neo-colonial powers now in Africa. So Rodney attended the University of the West Indies, the Mona campus in Jamaica. And after getting his degree there, he went to the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, in the United Kingdom in London. And after he got his PhD, he then went to teach in Tanzania. That was 1966-67, when Julius Nyerere was the president of Tanzania. Tanzania was then trying to implement ujamaa. Ujamaa is a Swahili word for brotherhood or familyhood. And that was Nyerere's vision of African socialism. Tried to collectivize agricultural production with the belief that the people concentrated together, they would be able to share the resources and increase their production. So he taught there for about a year, and then he went to the University of West Indies, his alma mater in Kingston, Jamaica. And he taught there from 1967, end of 67, up to not very long actually, 68. And what happened was that when he was in Tanzania, he engaged with the ordinary people. He went to the Ujamaa villages, as they were called, and interacted. He learned from them, and he also shared his knowledge with them. And he continued this practice when he was in Jamaica. He engaged with the Rastafari, who historically had been stereotyped, marginalized, and demonized, and cast as a criminal caste in the elite petty bourgeoisie media. And he engaged with them, and he empowered them intellectually and spiritually. And the conservative government at the time in Jamaica, under Hugh Pearson, saw that as a threat. And ordinary people are now becoming conscious and understanding why their country and as a class, why they are always mired in poverty. So Rodney taught them that there were external conditions that played a role in their impoverishment in Jamaica, and that their own government was also party to that by acting as the local agents for Western capital and imperialism. And the government saw that as a threat. So when Rodney had gone to attend a international conference of black writers in Canada, he was declared persona non grata in Jamaica by the government, and he was prevented from returning to his teaching position. And that unilateral and unlawful decision by the government actually provoked violent protest and uprising, leading to some deaths and leading to destruction of property, millions of dollars worth of property. And that was under the government of Hugh Shearer. I think I misstated his name earlier. That was the government, the prime minister at the time. So he was declared persona non grata. He could not come back into the country, and that was on October 15, 1968. So from there, Rodney went back to teach in Tanzania in the University of Dar es Salaam, and he taught there for a few years. And then he started teaching at various institutions around the world, including right here in the United States. Ultimately, he was offered a teaching position in his country of birth, Guyana, but he could never take up that position. He could never take up that position because the appointment was rescinded before he could take up the post. So at this point, I want to talk a little bit about Rodney's analysis of the African condition. As many of you who've heard previous podcasts know, and many of you that are familiar with his work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Rodney basically explained the integration of Africa from the 15th century onwards into the global system where everything was commodified, including the individuals, the Africans, the labor of Africans commodified, and that of course became the source of building surplus in the so-called New World, and then in the era that followed enslavement during colonization. Colonization, of course, was just a continuation of slavery and enslavement in a different form. Now, rather than bringing Africans to the so-called New World, the Europeans went to Africa to continue the system of extorting surplus, extracting surplus on the African continent, and divided the African countries amongst themselves. So Rodney felt that the formal independence was very critical, but formal independence did not result in the social, economic, or political transformation. Because in order to do that, the economies would have to change fundamentally in structure. The products that Africans produced, whether it was from the land, the farms, whether it was from industries, factories, would have to employ their domestic inputs, the material domestically generated to produce products that would be consumed within that country, meaning the economic planning would be based on what are the needs of this particular African country, and in order to fulfill those needs, what resources would be required. And that, of course, would determine how the budget is allocated and how capital is devoted to extract the resources that would produce the products that were in demand. But in African countries, you had, and you still have, the complete opposite, where the number one question would always be, what do we produce to export to meet the desires of the industrialized countries that are already wealthy? And Rodney felt and believed, and he was absolutely right, and is still right, that the petty bourgeoisie, the ruling class in African countries, the political elite, the military elite, they would never be able to address those concerns and to make the fundamental change in the economic systems that were required. Because so long as their own selfish needs were met, high-paying jobs, belonging in sophisticated circles connected with the establishments in the West, what incentive would they have to implement policies that would benefit their own people, and at the same time would have to challenge the West and the industrialized countries? So they became comfortable just getting the support of the International Monetary Fund to implement a sort of this same type of structure that existed in the Western industrialized countries, where you have a ruling elite that is relatively much more wealthy than the masses, and they, in essence, run the state, and they also run the economic system. So you have these elites replicated in the multiple African countries, implementing economic plans that are drawn up or approved by the World Bank and the IMF. And those plans are never going to serve the interest of the masses of Africans. And that is why Rodney was very critical of the elite. And he once said, the petty bourgeoisie as a class is unable constitutionally to lead any third world country anywhere except to destruction. You know, I myself don't use the word third world, but you get the point that Rodney was making. So what would be the solution then? The solution was working class parties, because those are the people that are actually affected by these policies drawn up by the African elite in conjunction with the World Bank, the IMF, the so-called Washington Consensus. So it would make sense that the people that are impacted and that would benefit from the change would have to actually be in power. So they would have to create their own political parties that represented the interests of the working class. And in Africa, Rodney identified the working class as the wage earners, as well as some elements of the rural farmers in Africa. And for a good analysis that he made of this analysis that he made, I would strongly recommend a lecture, which is also on video form, Crisis in the Periphery, Africa and the Caribbean. And this is also on YouTube. So I strongly recommend that you check it out. And obviously, developing working class parties in African countries are quite challenging, given that there's no tradition of that. The trade unions in African countries that were actually relatively very vibrant and very impactful during the colonial regime have all been emasculated, destroyed, or co-opted. Trade unions were very critical in the independence of Ghana, for example, when Ghana was still the Gold Coast, with the trade unions that were really at the forefront, leading protests and supported Kwame Nkrumah when he emerged as the leading politician in Ghana and led the country to independence. And by the way, March 6th was also the anniversary of Ghana's independence. So I also say happy birthday to Ghana. And so it's really going to be a challenge creating parties in Africa that are oriented toward the working class. Because right now, the parties that lead African countries, whether the ones that are in power, whether the ones that are in opposition, are the parties by the elite, of the elite, and for the elite. The only time they really engage fully with working class people, with students, with rural farmers, is when they are coming to campaign. Every 5 years, whatever the cycle is, hoping to win political power. And then after they win power, they go back to business as usual, running the neo-colonial state in Africa, not the type of transformative state that needs to change the relationship between African countries collectively and the neo-colonial powers that still maintain the same type of relationship that existed during the colonial era. So today, Africa remains producers of raw materials, natural and mineral resources, and cheap labor for Western factories that set location in African countries, but are fully owned by those multinationals. So Africans are not even industrializing. In fact, many African countries have been de-industrializing. And that is the condition that exists today, not very different from condition that existed at the time of Africa's independence. In fact, in many cases, regressive. Things have become worse. Industrialization, for example, and trade. Let's take trade. By the 1970s or so, African countries' collective share of global trade was about 5 to 5.5%, which of course is abysmal and minuscule. But today, it's about 2.5%, or maybe even closer to 2%. So, and that, Walter Rodney actually warned about that as early as 1980 in a couple of lectures just before he was killed, that if this condition continues, we're going to see regressive type of outcome where there will be negative economic growth rates with marginal production. Meanwhile, the population would keep increasing, and that is the condition that in fact prevails today in many African countries. So Rodney wanted to finally implement his vision in Guyana. So even though he was denied the teaching position, he returned to Guyana, and he was one of the co-founders of the Working People's Alliance, which of course was the counterparty that he would have liked to have seen being created in African countries as well. And the Working People's Alliance was a party that wanted to bring all the Guyanese together, African Guyanese and Indian Guyanese, and get away from that politics of the ruling elite exploiting the historical division that had been promoted by the British during the colonial regime, and that was continued even after formal independence. Obviously, that was a very attractive proposition, and that party would have grown tremendously. So Forrest Burnham, who paid lip service by calling himself a socialist, was actually a reactionary. And in June 1980, Walter Rodney was assassinated with a bomb that was somehow tricked into receiving it by a government informant whom Rodney thought was an ally who was interested in seeing the emergence of a true working class party in Guyana. So Walter Rodney met his death in 1980, and that was, of course, a tremendous blow, a loss to Guyana, a loss to Africa, a loss to progressive elements all over the world. And as a testament to his legacy, There are numerous outlets, institutions around the world that have Walter Rodney Memorial Lectures. There's a Walter Rodney Foundation. It's based in Atlanta, and his family operates that foundation, so people can look it up if you Google it, and you can learn more about his life and his tremendous work and his tremendous contributions. And in addition to the books that I mentioned during this podcast, I want to recommend the two videos that are on YouTube. Crises in the Periphery, that I also mentioned earlier, Africa and the Caribbean by Walter Rodney. And our second lecture is Race and Class in Guyanese Politics. That is also on YouTube, and I've mentioned it in the past, where he really analyzes it and he explains how racism was used to promote intra-class conflict between Indian Guyanese and African Guyanese during colonial rule. But he then also takes that and shows the mirror image in African countries, where instead of now using race to promote ethnic division to keep themselves in power in Guyana, in African countries, the ruling class, the petty bourgeoisie, would use so-called ethnic differences, and I hate to use the word, but Rodney uses it, and he refers to it as so-called tribe, and I hate it because whenever tribe is used by Europeans, it's used as a pejorative with respect to Africa. But so that is the kind of division that the African elite used to promote to keep themselves in power and to divert the focus away from the fact that they are not serving the interests of Africa and Africans, but are basically serving the interests of the Western industrial countries. In essence, they serve the role that colonial governors used to serve during the colonial regime in Africa. So thank you, sisters and brothers, friends, comrades. That ends episode number 27. In the next episode, I want to look at the political economy of COVID-19 and vaccinations in African countries. So I'll focus on our contemporary issue. Thank you so much. Stay well, stay strong, and as always, remain Pan-African. See you soon.